It's really wonderful to see such a huge crowd in this small room. Thank you so much for coming out. So my name is Suraj Ahmed, and I've been asked to be the moderator. And for me, the best moderators are the ones who don't really say anything at all. But unfortunately, I've been asked to say something at the beginning. So let me just say a few things. It feels to me like since October 7th, a bunch of basic historical facts get erased in the national discourse, particularly by intellectuals who unequivocally condemned Hamas before they start speaking, and the countless media personalities who always demand such condemnation, particularly when it's an Arab or Muslim or Palestinian speaker who's being interviewed. So it feels to me like the first suppressed fact is that colonized people have an internationally acknowledged right to armed resistance. And the second suppressed fact is that Palestinians are a colonized people. Right? So I think what we've seen throughout the Gaza genocide is a telling inability of liberals, leftists, and intellectuals of all kinds to side with the colonized. They have sympathy with Palestinians to the extent that they're slaughtered, but cannot defend them when they resist their slaughter. And so, for me, this has really been the treason of the intellectuals during this historical moment. And it's taught me a lot about the limitations of academic discourse right now. There's no publicly acceptable language right now by which we could call for an end to the colonization of Palestine. Just to call for that is dangerous, actually. So I think we post-colonial intellectual types have not studied carefully enough the colonialism that survives still today, nor those who are still colonized, how they must struggle against their condition. And I think as a consequence of this failure of intellectuals to understand that colonialism is a persistent fact, and people who are colonized live in specific material and international conditions that dictate certain forms of resistance, I think as a consequence of all that, what passes as emancipatory thinking has really lost precision, substance, and depth. And I think freedom and liberation can become meaninglessly abstract concepts. So, I've been thinking about this as I've been teaching about Palestine over the past month or so and thinking about it. So I'm particularly indebted to the organizers of this panel, Brits and Corinna and Sadia, wherever they are, and everyone else who's participated, in drawing our attention to the question of Palestinian resistance. And I'm even more grateful for the super eminent speakers who were so lucky who are coming here and have volunteered to teach us about the topic today. I know each of them because you can see them all over the web. If you Google their names, they've been active all the time. I can only imagine how exhausted they are. So I just really want to thank them. Okay, so let me just give brief introductions to all three. To my right is Tareq Baconi. He is the president of the board of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and the book review editor for the Journal of Palestine Studies. He's the author of Hamas Contained, The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance, which I highly recommend. His writing has also appeared in the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, and the Washington Post, among other places. And he's frequently interviewed by media outlets around the world. Charlotte Cates, who will be obviously joining us virtually, is the international coordinator of Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network and an organizer with the Palestinian Right to Return Coalition. She's a graduate of Rutgers School of Law. Her writing on Palestine has appeared in Electronic Intifada, Mondoweiss, Jadaliyya, and Jacobin, among other venues. Nerdeen Kiswani, to my right, is the founder. She needs obviously no introduction, but she's the founder and chair of Within Our Lifetime, community-based Palestinian-led organization committed to revitalizing the diasporic Palestinian revolutionary spirit in pursuit of a free homeland. She's a graduate of CUNY Law School, where she was a class speaker and has become an internationally renowned, tireless, and fearless spokesperson, and activist for Palestinian liberation.
Thank you for that. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this. I think these teach-ins are so important, and they really give us space and passion to continue doing what we're doing. So I'm grateful to be included in this space. So I was asked to talk specifically about Hamas and to maybe begin giving some context to the moment that we find ourselves in. And I, like Nerdeen, actually, we were talking just before, I value very much the Q&A more than sort of me speaking at you. So I'd like to keep some time for that. But what I thought would be helpful is to give 3 quick pointers that might help ground some of the discussions that we have, and for the activists and educators here, that might give them some tools to begin battling some of the narratives that we're facing outside of this room. So the 3 points I want to make are, one is around Hamas itself and its role in the Palestinian liberation struggle. I want to talk about Gaza a bit and structurally place Gaza within the context of the Palestinian, the colonization of Palestine. And I want to, the third point I want to make is specifically around October 7th and what happened on October 7th and how we got to that point. So the first point, so around Hamas, I don't really know the level of knowledge in the room, so I'm just going to give a sort of a basic primer. But in terms of how we understand Hamas, I think it's very important to always place it within the context of Palestinian nationalism. So Hamas is very much an Islamist and a nationalist party, which means that it is committed and confined to the borders of historic Palestine. Historically, it's only worked within those borders, and its resistance has only manifested within the borders of historic Palestine. Its Islamism is often used against the movement in Islamophobic terms to try to position it alongside organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which ends up decontextualizing the movement and deterritorializing it. And it's really important to keep grounded in the nationalist framework, because like other Muslim Brotherhood organizations around the Middle East, even though it comes from an ideology that's regional, its political program is actually nationalist. So it is confined to the borders of historic Palestine. Now, what is most important for us to keep in mind when we're thinking about Hamas's political ideology and Hamas's nationalist ideology is that in some ways, it's the continuation of the same kind of Palestinian nationalism that's been unfolding for almost a century now. And the core drivers that animate what Hamas is are actually exactly the same drivers that animated the PLO before it. But those drivers are couched in an Islamist ideology, whereas for the PLO, it was couched in an anti-colonial revolutionary ideology speaking to the moment. So in the past, let's say the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the PLO emerged as an organization that was committed to armed resistance for the liberation of Palestine. So for the duration of the PLO's mandate, it was really committed to undoing Zionism, to dismantling Zionism on the land of historic Palestine. And there were different iterations in how that ideology it grew and unfolded. But that was the core of its mission, and it aligned itself with other anti-colonial movements globally. So not only in the region, but also in other parts of the world. Now, by 1988, we have a PLO that's beginning to concede for various reasons, which we can talk about. It emerges as a movement that makes a historic concession, which is to recognize the state of Israel on 78% of the land of Palestine and to lay down its weapons. And rather than continue to remain committed to armed resistance, strategically makes the decision that the only way Palestinians can experience self-determination is through a partitioned Palestine. Now, almost at exactly the same time that the PLO lays down its weapons, we have the emergence of Hamas. And Hamas rises as a movement that takes that mantle forward under an Islamist garb. And so Hamas emerges as a movement that, like the PLO before it, is committed to armed resistance for the full liberation of Palestine. And it explains that in rather than anti-colonial revolutionary movements, which is embedded in the movement's ideology, but is not as explicit, it explains that within an Islamist framing, which is to say that it defined Palestine as Waqf, which is an Islamic trust that is placed for Palestinians in perpetuity, and it uses that to fight back against notions of partition. Now, that political platform evolves over the course of Hamas's history, and we can talk about what that evolution looks like. And the movement actually does put forward significant concessions over the course of its lifetime, but its commitment to the full liberation of Palestine and its commitment to the use of armed struggle is always there, even when the movement sort of pulls back and engages in other forms of resistance, because obviously it understands that armed struggle is not the only form of resistance for Palestinian liberation. So that's the first point I want to make, placing Hamas within its historical context and within the context of Palestinian nationalism and the continuation of that. And we can talk a bit maybe in the Q&A, but specifically this point that we now see in Western discourse around decimating Hamas, dismantling Hamas, destroying Hamas, why that is a genocidal goal. And it's important when we start thinking about Hamas in its economic infrastructure, in its social infrastructure, in its political infrastructure as the continuation of Palestinian nationalism, why that call becomes a genocidal call, not a call that's actually committed to dismantling Hamas. So that's kind of the first block that I want to put out there. The second is around the Gaza Strip specifically, and I think it's really important to dispel misconceptions that are often thrown around and that I found in my own work something to be fundamental to sort of confront. And it's this misconception that's held by Western policymakers and media platforms in the West specifically, which is that the Gaza Strip is blockaded because of Hamas. And this is ahistorical. And it's also factually incorrect. So the Gaza Strip, since 1948, has posed a challenge for successive Israeli governments. And since 1948, Israel has employed a different tactics to try to pacify the Gaza Strip. It's launched, before this genocidal war, 12 wars on the Gaza Strip. It's embedded collaborator networks throughout the Gaza Strip to try to pacify the population. It's tried economic strangulation and blockade measures before Hamas became what it became. And the blockade that we have in action today is a blockade that was actually instituted in the early 90s, shortly after Hamas was created, but not as a response to Hamas. So the reality of the Gaza Strip as a part of Palestine that is blockaded and that is actively being severed from Palestine has nothing to do with Hamas. It has everything to do with a demographic reality, which is that the Gaza Strip is composed of or has 2.3 million Palestinians living there, 2/3 of whom, more than 2/3, are refugees claiming the right to return to lands that are now in Israel. So not only does the severing of the Gaza Strip provide the opportunity for Israel to pretend that those refugees are not its problem, but it also allows it to pretend that it's still a Jewish majority state, even while it continues to hold on to the West Bank in its colonial effort there. So the idea that the Gaza Strip has to be severed and separated demographically from the rest of historic Palestine is central to Zionist understanding in Israel. Now, the Hamas's emergence and its takeover of the Gaza Strip in 2007 provides Israel with a perfect fig leaf to enact a blockade, because right at that moment there's this organization that in the West is understood to be a terrorist organization that's committed to terrorism like Al-Qaeda, that justifies a security doctrine that then enables a blockade. And therefore we have a situation where Israel is able to say, oh, we have a security threat. Gaza legally becomes a hostile entity rather than an occupied territory, and this justifies the blockade, while at the same time, paradoxically, Israel then begins engaging with Hamas as a stabilizing force in the Gaza Strip and the governing authority. So we have this somehow paradoxical situation where Hamas is this supposedly terrorist organization that's committed to Israel's destruction, but also a force that Israel needs to stabilize the Gaza Strip and to maintain Gaza as this entity that can exist but not really live, and that is frozen in time and frozen in space on the side of historic Palestine. So structurally, we have to understand Gaza within this context, and I'd go one step further and say that for Israel, Gaza is the model about how populations, Palestinian populations, can be confined to limited territory and surrounded by Jewish settlements in a way that allows Israel to maintain the facade that it is a Jewish majority state, where so the Gaza Strip, in other words, becomes the Bantustan model for other Palestinian urban centers throughout. And here it's really important to think about this beyond partitions. I'm not talking about areas A in the West Bank. I'm also talking about population centers in 48. So if we look at Nazareth, if we look at areas in Jerusalem, if we look at Jisr al-Azraq in 48, these are population centers within Israel that are Palestinian, that are surrounded by Jewish settlements. That is the Gaza model, and that's the one that's perfected when it comes to Gaza. So that's the Gaza block. I want to talk for a few minutes about October 7th, and then I'll turn over. So October 7th is a moment which is actually much clearer to understand retrospectively. For someone like me who studied Hamas, the first sort of a few hours after Hamas's attack, I realized that the movement had fundamentally overturned a structure that it had acquiesced to for 16 years before that, and that's the structure of containment. So Hamas, after its takeover in 2007, accepted the notion of containment, which is the notion that it could remain as a governing authority in the Gaza Strip, and that it would actively engage with Israel, but it would do so through the use of force, that it would use rocket fire to try to force Israel to ease restrictions into the Gaza Strip. Whenever the situation in the Gaza Strip became too difficult to bear, Hamas would launch rockets at Israel in order to force Israel to lift the blockade and ease restrictions. In response, Israel acquiesced to allowing Hamas to remain as a governing authority as long as it could have calm in the areas around the Gaza Strip. Now, in Israel's military doctrine, this calm did not take into account the fact that calm can never be achieved for a captive population and that the blockade itself is a structure of violence. So it would assume that it could have calm for calm, that there would be no military assaults on the Gaza Strip if Hamas doesn't fire rockets. The structure of the blockade was never was never questioned. And Hamas acquiesced to that. For 16 years, it accepted that this is the situation it would be in, and actually actively began restricting resistance from the Gaza Strip because it feared the military retaliation that Palestinians in Gaza would be exposed to. Now, over the course of the past 5 years, really from 2018, we start seeing a shift. The first shift was the Great March of Return, where Hamas allowed for Palestinian civil society in Gaza to explore other tactics, predominantly popular resistance, as a way of forcing Israel to lift the blockade. And Hamas learned that actually the international community didn't care that Palestinians were being sniped off, even though it was a popular movement, and that didn't enable it to get any concessions from Israel. So that's one lesson. And then fast forward 2021, we see Hamas, for the first time since the blockade is instituted, begin to fire rockets at Israel, not because of challenges in the Gaza Strip, but because of colonization in East Jerusalem, what Israel is doing in Sheikh Jarrah. And so we see Hamas begin to transition into a stance which is broader than only focused on the Gaza Strip, and into a position that places it as more focused on Palestinians writ large. And so Hamas is beginning to transition. Now it's easy to see retroactively that Hamas was preparing for a move that would disrupt the containment and would actively begin to take the offensive in terms of fighting back against the paradigm that it had been forced into. Now, we can talk a bit more about the actual day and how that unfolded in the Q&A. But for me, regardless of how this moves forward, and the genocide is ongoing, so it's difficult to talk about this and to talk about where this lands Palestinians. I think things are very much up in the air. But the thing that is very clear, and that cannot be denied, is that within the space of a few hours, Hamas was able to undermine a central pillar of Zionism, which is that this is a safe haven for the Jewish people, and that Jews, Israeli Jews, can feel safe while apartheid persists. So it's clear that now there is no safety for Israeli Jews as long as apartheid persists. And Hamas made that clear by the scale of its attack and by the success of the attack, which within a few hours overturned the idea that Israel actually is invincible. It showed that to be a house of cards. And so there's no turning back from that. Now, every effort will be put in place to try to bring Hamas back into containment, to try to bring Palestinians back into Bantustan. But the fact that that pillar of Zionism has been shattered, for me, for my reading, is irreversible. So that puts us in a new paradigm. And I think what we're seeing in the ferocity of the retaliation that we're seeing now, and I don't really like to think of it as retaliation because it's enacting plans of ethnic cleansing that obviously predate Hamas's attack. But what the ferocity of what we're seeing now is a response to that knowledge that we're now in a new paradigm, and it's in some ways existential for the Zionist movement. So I'll stop there, and we can talk about some of these things in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Tareq, for that brilliant analysis and context. I'm actually so glad that you went before me and the first person. I feel like you should just be the first person to speak whenever it comes to contextualizing Hamas and resistance, because that was so educational and powerful and honestly just a brilliant analysis. And, you know, I think that's why we saw so many Palestinian organizations, groups, and people rush you know, after October 7th and, you know, actually post about how Palestinians have been able to break out of the prison that they've been confined to, out of the concentration camp that they've been confined to, right? And then this is why, you know, when I was on Piers Morgan and all these other interviews you see that, you know, he's having with other Palestinian speakers or just journalists in general, just hammering home from the very beginning the question, like, do you condemn Hamas? Do you condemn, you know, the attacks on October 7th, right? To confine us to a timeline that doesn't apply to us, because we've been facing this for over 75 years before the creation of the Zionist entity that was created through force, that was created through genocide, that was created through mass graves and rapes. And a lot of the things that, you know, we see are continuing now. And, you know, as Tareq said, the siege and the blockade and the structure of maintaining it in and of itself, it's violent. When half the population of Gaza is under the age of 18 years old, they don't have electricity for 16 hours a day sometimes. Infrastructure continues to fall apart because of previous bombings, because of decimation of entire neighborhoods, and the siege and blockade that limits, you know, building materials from coming in. You know, at one point, the strategy that Israel actually publicly, they didn't admit it publicly, but it was leaked, was to not put Gaza into full starvation mode so they don't trigger a full-on humanitarian crisis, but allow in just enough calories per person to keep them on a diet, quote unquote. So, you know, these are all structures of violence that Palestinians are facing every day. The fact that most Palestinians living in Gaza, to begin with, are refugees from towns and villages that are 20 minutes, 30 minutes away, but that they can't get to because of the border. So, you know, just to hammer home the point about the Great Return March, or because of the occupations border, but just to hammer home the points about the occupation, the Great Return March that Tareq mentioned earlier, in 2018, thousands of Palestinians marched to the border every single Friday for 2 years straight. And you know, demanding the right to return to their original homes in towns and villages, because the so-called like humanitarian crisis in Gaza is not happening by accident. It's because Israel has created that way. That is the structure that they place Palestinians under. And, you know, the issue of having lack of water, lack of electricity, lack of, you know, even like waste management, that could be solved by allowing the right of return to Palestinians, which is another a right that Palestinians have under international law, but doesn't apply to us. Just like, you know, the right for an occupied population to resist their occupation seems to not, you know, apply to us as well. And, you know, how did Israel react? They set up snipers along the borders, shooting protesters, shooting medics like Razan and Najjar, who the New York Times, you know, tried to undermine and say that, you know, actually she wasn't innocent, or she was, you know, doing something wrong, or something that warranted her to be killed, you know, to begin with, when she's an 18-year-old girl in a white coat. Journalists like Yasser Murtaja, much like we see the targeting of journalists today, and babies, you know, killed by tear gas. There was even an Israeli soldier who admitted in an Israeli publication later on, actually boasting that he wanted to make a game of how many Palestinian kneecaps he can get in one day, you know, shooting Palestinians at the Great Return March, and he counted 42. So this is what happened when Palestinians, you know, when people always ask us, where's the Palestinian Gandhi? Where is the mass nonviolent movement? You know, like, I've actually heard people say this to me after this has happened, not even knowing that it happened. You know, what if Palestinians all just put down their arms and just went en masse, and, like, you know, they tried that and they got shot, they got tear gassed, they were killed, and people here didn't care. How do I know? Because we tried to keep up with the people of Gaza. We had a protest on the first Friday of the Great Return March that they had, and we kept trying to have protests every single Friday here in New York City, and we couldn't even maintain the momentum that they were keeping every day, and less people would have the rallies. You know, people saw us when we had just 10, 20 people standing with us in Washington Square Park on Fridays in solidarity with the Great Return March, and people, you know, didn't care. So, you know, the history of all colonized people and how they achieve liberation has always been through resisting by any means necessary. A phrase that, you know, many of you are familiar with from Malcolm X, and we, you know, learn about this in school, and it's okay to talk about it in certain contexts, but then when you actually apply it to what people are facing today, suddenly, you know, you can be called a terrorist sympathizer, you can be called an anti-Semite, when in reality, it's just there has never been any case in history where oppressed people achieve liberation by just asking for it nicely. And when Palestinians, you know, did do that through the Great Return March, they were just killed. So it's important for us to understand that no matter what political organizations or entities exist, as long as Palestinians are subjugated, colonized, as long as there's a siege and blockade, as long as occupation persists, which is in Israel's nature and character to begin with, that's how it's able to maintain its nature as a so-called Jewish majority, you know, ethno state, right? As the speakers before me have mentioned, Palestinians will continue to resist, and that's what I said. If you want to kill Palestinian resistance, you're going to have to kill every single Palestinian. Palestinians will continue to resist from every corner of the world, from everywhere we are, with everything we have. And that's a lot of the consciousness that we've seen become grown in a lot of Palestinians, especially over this past month, right? Much like what's happening in Gaza is not separate from what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah and Al-Quds. You know, we're not separate from that either. As a Palestinian living in the diaspora, like, I understand that as a refugee, I was born in Jordan. I could have ended up in Gaza. I have family members that ended up in Gaza, right? My life is not any more precious than the 11,000 Palestinians who have been killed in the last month alone. It's not. And so, despite threats of doxing or actually being doxed, despite constant threats I receive every day, even while sitting here, I saw a pop-up in my email, you know, saying like, we're gonna kill you all, like, I'm gonna come shoot you down. Like, these are things that I hear, you know, every single day, despite, you know, being told that I'm not going to get through character and fitness through the bar. Despite all of these things, this feels like nothing to me in comparison to what the people of Gaza have to sacrifice every single day. And my right to a comfortable life, a livelihood, is not more of, I don't have more of a right than the people of Gaza do. So just understanding that we are part of a national liberation struggle, and wherever we are, we need to contribute to it because we owe that to our people. The fact that we can continue to call ourselves Palestinian, and the fact that there is a Palestine, is the people living on that land who maintain resistance to Israeli colonization and subjugation, and who maintain Palestinian identity. So it's important for us to honor that as much as we can by mobilizing people here, by educating people here, especially for those of us who live in the belly of the beast. Our taxes are going to kill our very own people. $3.8 billion, $10 million a day. We live in this country, we pay taxes, our taxes are going to the bombs that are being dropped on Gaza. And so it's a responsibility on our end, on every level, whether, moral, religious, political, social, it's a responsibility for us to maintain resistance to Israeli occupation and to use all of the resources that we have here to do that, because the media companies like CNN that repeated the lie, that had to retract the lie, their headquarters is right here in New York City, because our president is actively conducting this genocide, also repeating lies that he had to admit later, saying that he saw photos of beheaded children, right? But how many of you have seen horrible photos, videos on your screens, on Instagram of Palestinian children over and over and over again, and that's not something that he's willing to mention. And so it's important for us to just put into perspective, what we are sacrificing, what we are giving up by speaking up for Palestine, because that price is still so small compared to what the people of Gaza, the people of all of Palestine, are giving up, to support Palestinian liberation. Even Palestinian citizens of Israel, of so-called Israel, are getting arrested for posting about what's going on, for posting anything that, expresses support for Palestinian freedom and liberation. Palestinians in the West Bank are being imprisoned daily. These prisoners are being beaten daily. These are things that, the media is not focusing on as much, and this has been happening. There was a massacre in Jenin the other day. 14 Palestinians were killed. My sisters and I just came back from Palestine after being there this summer. Every single day that we were there was a martyr. And before October 7th, on average, there was at least one Palestinian killed every single day this year alone. So this is the reality that we contend with every day. And we understand that our job to resist what's happening in Palestine doesn't end when the bombs stop dropping, doesn't end when there's a ceasefire, but continues until the siege and blockade ends, until the occupation ends, and until every inch of Palestine is free from the river to the sea. Because when we talk about Palestinians, when we don't talk about the right of return, we don't talk about the Palestinians living in exile, then we are effectively leaving most Palestinians out of the conversation, because most of us are in exile. And that's why the right of return is so central to our struggle and what connects us as people living in exile to it the most. And for people who are not Palestinian, fighting for Palestinian liberation is also fighting for your liberation. Zionism is white supremacy. Zionism is funding, is supporting, is supplying weapons to repressive regimes around the world. That Israel trains with the NYPD. They train with the same fascist police forces that are trying to shut down protesters in Stop Cop City and Standing Rock and here in New York City when it comes to so many other liberation struggles. The drones that they're using over us at our protests are Israeli drones that Eric Adams announced when he came back to New York City. So, the technology, the weapons, the conversations that Israel has with the U.S., that has with other imperialist nations and oppressive regimes around the world are to repress people everywhere. And there's a lot of information, and I'm not going to get into it all now, but historically, Israel is one of the last supporters of apartheid South Africa. Wherever you see oppression in the world, somehow you can connect it back to Israel. And this is not just like a random statement I'm making. There's actually a great resource called Israel's Worldwide Role in Repression, produced by the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. And it might be a bit of an old resource, so it has older examples, but there's much more examples that we're seeing contemporary, every single day. And so it's important for all of us to resist fascist ideologies like Zionism everywhere we see it, and understand that they are affecting our liberation too. We know that as Palestinians living in exile, as much as we can do, we're part of a larger liberation struggle. We call ourselves within our lifetime because we believe that Palestine, if we fight for Palestine, like it is going to be free within our lifetime, then we can make that happen. But with the understanding that we know that we're not the ones freeing Palestine. It's Palestinians resisting on the ground that are doing that. But we understand that Palestine is freeing us and helping us free everyone around us, to understand why colonization is wrong, and not just in Palestine, but the same colonization that we saw massacre indigenous people here in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the forces of imperialism that are a continuation of that tradition, and why it's important for us to fight that with everything we have from everywhere we are. And I'll address anything else in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nerdeen and Tareq, for these excellent presentations. I'm just turning on my screen now because I noticed earlier that when I turned on my screen, it put the speakers who are in person into shadow on the Zoom. So after I speak again in the Q&A, I will again turn off my camera until it's time for me to make a comment, just so that we avoid that lighting effect that seems to happen in this way. But thank you both for those brilliant, insightful, and inspiring presentations and talks, and really calls to action, not just talks and calls to action. The connection that I'm making today and the discussion that I'm participating in today is how this history and present of Palestinian resistance is also linked to the so-called war on terror and the legal framework of repression that has been instituted in the United States and internationally among the imperialist powers in order to suppress the Palestinian community's participation in resistance, and in order to suppress open and clear solidarity with Palestinian resistance from a principled and political perspective. One of the things that has been quite clear, particularly since October 7th, but really I think throughout the decades, if we look honestly at the situation, if we look honestly at the level of support, funding, military aid provided by the United States and its partners to the Zionist regime in occupied Palestine, then this is certainly nothing new. But it has certainly been more obvious, vocal, and open, perhaps, than at any time in recent history, or at least in the past 20 years, and that has been that the analysis that was initially laid out in 1969 in the Strategy for the Liberation of Palestine regarding the enemies that the Palestinian people and the Palestinian Liberation Movement face is very much just as true today as it ever was, and perhaps more true than it ever was. And specifically, the enemies of the Palestinian people, as laid out in the strategy, were not just the Israeli occupation regime, not just Israel as a Zionist entity, but also the Zionist movement, which we see exemplified from everything like Canary Mission to the organizations that are sending doxing trucks around New York with names of students, to the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, which is holding its convention in Colorado at the end of the month, to fundraise for further dispossession and displacement of Palestinians on colonized land, for example, particularly in the Negev Desert. But beyond the Zionist movement and the Israeli occupation, that there are other enemies that the Palestinian movement faces, namely imperialism led by the United States and Arab reactionary regimes typically working in alignment with and in subservience to imperialism. And one thing that has been tremendously visible in the past 40 days, perhaps more than again in 20 years, is the full alignment and support of the imperialist powers with with the Zionist regime and with this genocidal assault on Gaza. And one of the reasons why that has become so visible and not kind of measured or conditioned with limiting statements about how, of course, we're concerned about human rights, or of course, we're concerned about human lives, or of course, we're concerned about minimizing civilian casualties, is because October 7th was such a pivotal moment. And October 7th was a pivotal moment because the power of the Palestinian resistance on a military level and the level of strategy, planning, and development that was clearly visible indicated several things. One of those things being that it was possible to conceive of the defeat and of the military defeat of the Zionist regime, which meant it was possible to conceive of the defeat of the imperialist project in the region, which has always regarded the Zionist regime as a sort of aircraft carrier or a base for imperialist support in the region. As Joe Biden said, if Israel didn't exist, we would have to create it, in order to serve U.S. interests. And fundamentally, that is the role that is being played by the Zionist project, no matter what kinds of eliminationist and fascist rhetoric are used to propel a sense of allegiance to this imperialist settler colonial project in the region. So one of those things was power of Palestinian resistance on a military level. And the second of those things was how well the Palestinian resistance was clearly integrated with regional resistance forces, ranging from Lebanon to Yemen to Iran and Syria, that there is a regional source of resistance that is capable of meaningfully confronting imperialism, not only in being a victim of its wars and occupations and assaults and sanctions and blockades, but is able to extract a significant cost from the occupation. And this was an underestimation that had been made about the Palestinian resistance for some time, that the most the resistance would be able to do is simply to kind of throw unguided missiles toward Ascalon or Tel Aviv or, Nativ Hassara or Sderot, and that would be kind of, or that, in the West Bank, that it would be possible to maybe defend the center of Jenin refugee camp, but that was the limit of the Palestinian resistance's power. And what October 7th showed was that was not true. And not only that was not true, it revived one of the lessons of 2021, which is that the Palestinian resistance is, in many ways, in its military wings, is responsive to the demands of the Palestinian population. And so, in 2021, as Tareq said earlier, when we saw the resistance in Gaza respond to the attacks on homes in Shira and in Jerusalem, we saw that this was a response to a popular demand by the Palestinian people for the resistance to get involved. And specifically on October 7th, one of the things that we see is a response by the resistance to the popular demand of the Palestinian people to take action to liberate the Palestinian prisoners, which at that time were approximately 5,250, and at this time were approximately 8,000, not counting the unclear number of workers from Gaza, Palestinian workers who have been detained by the occupation, some of whom were released without ID in their property in Gaza, but not all of whom were. And so Itamar Ben-Gvir, of course, the notorious fascist, has been named the head of the Minister of National Security in the Netanyahu government. And when he's not engaging in fascist eliminationist rhetoric, he has been proclaiming new ways to punish and torture the Palestinian prisoners. And this is something that has evoked a tremendous amount of outrage. And we can talk a little bit more about the prisoners movement and the prisoners situation later in the Q&A. But just to note that it is a popular demand of the Palestinian people on their resistance to take the kind of action that is necessary in order to liberate all of the Palestinian prisoners, including certainly the women prisoners, the child prisoners, the administrative detainees jailed without charge or trial, but also the resistance leaders, the military leaders, the freedom fighters who are serving multiple life sentences in Israeli occupation prisons. And it's been clear throughout the history of Palestinian resistance that the only reliable way to liberate Palestinian prisoners from the occupation's jails is by conducting a prisoner exchange. And October 7th illustrated a lot of things, including the ability to address the issue of the so-called Gaza envelope settlements that were established around the area of Gaza, to address the military bases that were in the area, but also certainly to capture prisoners of war that were necessary in order to obtain the release of the thousands upon thousands of Palestinian hostages that have been jailed in Israeli occupation prisons, many of for over 30 years. So with that being said, just as we've seen the full alignment of imperialism with Zionism in this assault, in this genocide that is taking place on Gaza, this is an attempt to take away that possibility, which was clearly envisioned and which was in the minds and hearts of kind of everybody who looked at the images of October 7th as they were taking place, including those kind of iconic images such as the bulldozer tearing down the siege fence that had been placed around Gaza, around these colonial imposed borders. It is possible for people to obtain their freedom. It is possible for the system to be defeated. Zionism can be defeated, the resistance can win. And everything that we've seen since then is a genocidal attempt to erase that reality from people's minds, from people's consciousness, and from possibility. And in many ways, and I agree that this is a futile attempt, but it is what is being carried out, and it's being carried out through the targeting of Palestinian civilians due to the fundamental, which fits well with the occupation's power, which rests in aerial bombardment and armament targeting provided by the United States and its drones, rather than being able to engage in ground combat with the resistance, where the occupation suffers significant losses every single time it combats that. But to connect that to the kind of history of so-called terrorist lists and what it actually means when we constantly hear demands to condemn Hamas is to go back a couple of decades back to the Oslo Accords. Now, of course, I think most people at this point are aware that the Oslo Accords were not a process of peace that were created for Palestinians, but were a process that was intended to liquidate the Palestinian cause into living with a permanent so-called self-government or self-rule government, we might call it, but that was always meant as a subordinate partner both to the Zionist regime and to its larger partners, the major imperialist powers. And so the Oslo Accords were never moving toward the creation of a meaningful Palestinian state, not to mention that a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza would itself only mean the continuation of colonialism, apartheid, and fundamental injustice on 78% of occupied Palestine. That it was never intended to lead there in the first place. It was intended to provide a few concessions to some top Palestinian capitalists and perhaps provide a home for Palestinian capital and investment, but not to provide any kind of meaningful political sovereignty, self-determination, or certainly national liberation. And of course, the Oslo Accords were conducted in a process that was led by the United States in the period immediately following the decline and fall of the socialist camp, particularly in Eastern Europe, and a period immediately following the first Gulf War and the devastation of Iraq and the imposition of ongoing sanctions. It was in this context that the Oslo Accords were fundamentally imposed upon the Palestinian people with the collaboration of the then leadership of the PLO. I mean, including those who are continuing to serve as the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. It's Mahmoud Abbas's signature that was on the Declaration of Principles that was signed in Washington, D.C. in September 1993, so 30 years ago. The October 7th essentially came on the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords. And the current structure and framework of anti-terror legislation that we have in the United States and the current framework of material support for terrorism, which is constantly used as a mechanism to terrify and defang movements for the liberation of Palestine in the United States and internationally, was created as part and parcel of the Oslo Accord process. Now, that doesn't mean that Palestinians were not persecuted in the United States prior to the Oslo Accords. There are many examples from the deportation of Ziad Abu Ain to the persecution of the Los Angeles Eight that represented the ongoing commitment of the United States to maintaining and extending the Zionist project and to criminalizing Palestinian resistance, which it labeled as terrorism. But the current legal framework was created by then President Bill Clinton in 1995, first as an executive order prohibiting financial transactions, and the financial transactions that were prohibited were very specifically those which would interfere with or disrupt the Middle East peace. So in other words, specifically, the list of foreign terrorist organizations that we have in the United States was specifically created in order to maintain the Oslo process and stigmatize, defund, and criminalize all those Palestinian organizations, which included Hamas, Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and a number of other Palestinian organizations, as well as, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which at that time had not yet fully achieved the liberation of South Lebanon that would come in 2000, that this list of organizations was specifically prohibited and specifically criminalized because they were opposed to the Oslo Accords, because they presented disruption to this process of the liquidation of the Palestinian cause and the liquidation of the Arab cause. In 1996, this, which had been a financial rule promulgated as an executive order, was created as criminal law by the U.S. Congress through the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. This is what created the material support laws that we know today that said it's a crime. You can go to jail for material support for foreign terrorist organizations, which include all of these Palestinian resistance organizations. Now, in 2001, the laws were further developed and strengthened in the so-called Patriot Act. So it came hand in hand with the rest of the War on Terror framework that we saw in 2001. This is also when we saw the same kind of legislation adopted in Canada, the European Union, Australia, Britain, and other countries. All of these countries certainly had repressive legislation. They were anti-Palestinian, they were imperialist, they had ways of criminalizing Palestinian resistance, but the specific adoption of the list of terrorist organizations and this framework of material support that has been copied around the world came from the 1996 laws and then the 2001 Patriot Act. Many of those were not necessarily adopted in other countries, but specifically, once again, came out of this framework attempting to impose the Oslo Accords upon the Palestinians, to impose Osloization and to impose liquidation of their cause. So this expansion has kind of led to this idea of, that's been legitimized by the U.S. Supreme Court, that coordination, or training or providing resources of any kind to a designated FTO could be held accountable for criminal prosecution. And the U.S. Engaged in some fairly high-profile cases that were meant to create this kind of terror against the community, from the Holy Land Foundation case, which targeted one of the largest Palestinian Muslim charities in the United States, to the case of Sami al-Abyan, to a number of other material support cases, many of which are not about Palestine, but these are some of the highest profile Palestine-related cases. And we can talk more. I know I've been speaking for a little bit long, so I don't want to go. We can talk more about some of those cases in detail and what they mean. But to say that this entire legal framework does not primarily exist to send people to jail. This legal framework does not primarily exist to persecute Palestinian charity leaders and send them to jail for 65 years to a maximum security prison, although that has been and is and remains the case. The primary purpose of this legislation is to render not only certainly at the center of it for the Palestinian community, to say that the Palestinian community in exile and diaspora cannot be a part of their national liberation movement in a way that involves engagement with the forces of resistance that are actually leading that movement. Secondly, it is to create a framework whereby the movement in solidarity with Palestine then looks outside of the resistance forces that are actually leading the movement for its beacons of solidarity and its political framework. And so fundamentally, in many ways, the so-called anti-terrorist laws exist to enforce the so-called two-state solution and the illusion and mirage of the so-called two-state solution, specifically through the path of Oslo negotiations and the Palestinian Authority. And in order to make it seemingly impossible to exist, to speak, and to advocate outside of that framework, and to openly stand in support of the Palestinian resistance politically and morally and all of these other ways, which are not covered by the law. You know, it is not illegal to talk about your support for the Palestinian resistance, including the armed resistance, including Hamas, including Islamic Jihad, including the PFLP, including all of these forces. And with that being said, one of, I think, the responsibilities of academics, of those in the academy, of those who have some amount of power and privilege in this society is to fight back against the designation of Palestinian resistance organizations as terrorist organizations, to openly campaign for the removal of these organizations from the so-called terror list. Of course, this also applies to Lebanese resistance organizations and other regional resistance forces, the absolute absurdity of listing another state's military force, such as the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, on the terror list is something that is worth exploring as well. But specifically on the political front, to declare openly and quite clearly that the Palestinian resistance forces represent a national liberation movement, that is backed up not only by international law, but by a fundamental sense of justice. And that one of the main mechanisms by which imperialism uses in order to suppress that movement is so-called anti-terror laws, anti-terror legislation, and the criminalization of resistance organizations, especially for Palestinians in exile and diaspora, but also for the broader solidarity movement. And if we want to effectively build solidarity with the Palestinian people, if we want to really fight to end genocide, if we want to meaningfully if we want our campaigns and our grassroots organizing for boycott to have an impact, then that also can and must include our solidarity with those who are on the ground fighting and to achieve Palestinian liberation and make it real. And those are the resistance forces that are being labeled as terrorist organizations by the United States and its imperialist partners. So looking forward to the discussion and moving forward. And I guess I should just say, as I close, that it's in this context that Samidoun, the organization that I represent, has been criminalized by the German government just last month. Actually, just this month. They announced that they were going to do it last month, and they did it this month, for speaking in support of the resistance. And the level of fascism that has developed in Germany against the Palestinian community, this is just one expression of it. This is just one expression of the level of fascism. Just today, there were raids on 54 homes, offices, and mosques related to the Shia community, saying that they're representatives of Hezbollah. Police order every demonstration organizer to read out a statement that no one can carry any of the symbols of the resistance, or for that matter, a Samidoun flag, or else they will be arrested and the demonstration will be declared illegal. And so they create an entire process by which anyone who wishes to organize a demonstration is forced by the police to become a policing agency against the community, against any expression of support for the resistance. So it's within this context that we are fighting back, that we are organizing, that we are facing the imperialist alliance with Zionism that is targeting Palestinians in Gaza and carrying out a genocide today. And by standing with the resistance, whether that is, even when that seems merely rhetorical, is not an empty gesture, but one that carries a great deal of significance. If it did not, our enemies would not go to so much trouble to try to criminalize and suppress it.
Food?
Yeah. We have like a training break and people can get some this and drink and think about your questions and then we'll come back to Q&A.
I feel like at some minute break, one of things not.
Hey, Britt,
Like, can we, people get slowly while we continue,
Yeah.
quietly while we continue?
can we, unfortunately, our speakers two of our speakers have to leave at 8:30. So what we would like is for people to get food, but do it quietly. And as you do it, maybe we can begin asking questions, because we definitely want to take advantage of Nerdeen and Tareq for the time that we have. Okay? So please proceed and get food. And maybe those of you who, well, it's going to be hard to find where the empty seats are, but I'd love for the people who are standing to be able to sit down. So does anyone have any questions that they'd like to begin with? Anyone at all? Maybe I'll just kill some time while people think about their questions. I really appreciated all the talk so much, and I'm grateful for Charlotte kind of emphasizing the point that is the kind of one of the obvious points that we need to keep in mind. Thinking about Palestinian resistance, which is the need for all of us, particularly those of us in positions of privilege, to express our solidarity with Palestinian resistance, particularly because it's criminalized. But unless we have solidarity with people on the ground in Palestine, there's really no way forward towards liberation. Liberation isn't going to happen except for the actions of resistance groups in Palestine, Hamas in particular, but not only. And so just thinking about that, I think the one question that will always be on everyone's mind, which is the one question I'm sure Tareq in particular does not want to answer, but I'm gonna ask it anyways, which is, how do we think the future right now? What the thing that we can't, it's a little bit hard to talk about, is the fact that there was a moment where Israel was in fact defeated. And it was defeated because Hamas is much more sophisticated and much better prepared than really any of us realized. And in that process, we learned that Hezbollah has also been stacking up, and that they are also ready, and they're also committed. And then we learned that Ansar Allah is also not going to back down, and that there are militias in Syria and Iraq. We've learned a lot in the past month, and we've learned perhaps that the axis of resistance is much more rational and much more strategic than Israel and the U.S. So all of this, for me, in my moments in the middle of the night, are reasons for optimism that I've not had for years now. But at the same time, with this optimism, it's like a slightly terrifying optimism, because it's the optimism of fighters who are willing to sacrifice their life. And they understand this to be a long war. Nasrallah calls it the beginning of the end, but how long that takes, we don't know. So I'm just wondering, in this moment of potential transition, how does Tareq and Nerdeen and Charlotte, how do they think about it? Without forcing them to tell us what they think is going to happen, how do you just deal with the suspense, the hope, the fear?
That's a big question. I mean, I guess I'll say a couple of things. The first is that it's important to understand the nature of what this war of liberation is. And as with any anti-colonial struggle, it's an asymmetric war. What that means is that it's a war that's waged by a people who are more poorly resourced and more poorly funded than the adversary, in this case, a nuclear power that's supported by the metropole here, which is the world superpower. And so in any asymmetric struggle, the colonized people win if the adversary doesn't win. As in, if the adversary wins, it means the elimination of the oppressed people. But for the oppressed people, all they need to do is to prevent the regime from winning, right? And so their goal is to remain and to unsettle the regime and end the idea of a full victory. Now, on October 7th, and I might differ here with some of the speakers, and maybe with your question around Hamas's strength, Hamas will never be able to defeat Israel militarily. That's just a fact. But Hamas can unsettle Israel and cause that apartheid regime to be dismantled only by continuing to exist as a force that refuses to give up arms. And this is where the notions of victory and defeat differ. So this isn't a symmetrical war between two equally armed forces. And in that sense, Hamas's victory looks very different than Israel's victory. And so in that instance, October 7th becomes something that I agree fundamentally disrupted the idea that the Palestinians have been defeated, which is the notion that Israel was using, and which is why it was expanding its colonial violence and continuing to act with impunity, because it believed that the Palestinian question has been defeated, that it doesn't matter that Palestinians can remain in their Bantustan's and that the Israeli apartheid regime can continue to operate normally. And the fact that Hamas was able to disrupt that is why Israel was defeated, and it becomes a point of victory for Hamas. But it's not victory in the way that we might imagine it, which is that Israel's military gets sort of completely dismantled. So I think that's the first thing to say. It's important to keep putting this in the context of asymmetry. And the second thing is to talk a bit about resistance. I think that obviously in the context of this conversation and what Charlotte was saying, the focus was on armed resistance, but it's important to think about that historically. And Palestinians have learned that actually armed resistance, because of the fact that they're facing a regime that's that's militarily stronger, that their resistance cannot only be armed. It has to be more expansive than that. It has to be popular. It has to be legal. It has to be diplomatic. It has to be on every form of, or every platform in which Palestinians exist. And this is why Nerdeen's point is really important. It has to exist. Also, sorry, I mispronounced your name. Sorry. I have a friend who's Nerdeen, so that's the first. The Palestinian, this is why the resistance that happens here is just as important. The grassroots resistance that happens in the diaspora, in institutions, the narrative warfare, the legal warfare is just as important. That's a form of supporting the resistance that's happening in Palestine. And the important thing here is always I agree with the point that Palestinian resistance fundamentally is in Palestine on the ground, but also the point to keep reiterating is that Palestinians in exile are not in exile by choice. You know, Palestinians in the diaspora are not in the diaspora by choice. This is a form or a result of settler colonialism. And so the resistance that happens globally, the resistance that happens regionally is just as important, because that's a form of resistance in the metropole. And other settler colonial struggles like Algeria and elsewhere, the battle, the war in the metropole was just as important as the war on the ground. So this is where this becomes fundamental. We cannot see it ground here, because this is where Israel gets a source of power and a source of legitimacy. And we see the aircraft carriers now going to Israel are a result of what the public opinion and the centers of power in the metropole are allowing to happen. And so this becomes a front for liberation that's just as important as what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, I echo everything Tareq said, and you know, in terms of what happens in the future, I think regardless, Palestinians will continue to take matters into our own hands from wherever we are to end the brutal siege and blockade that Gaza has been under for the better part of the last 2 decades, to end the occupation and colonization of Palestinian land. And you know, in this particular moment, while the Israeli public at first and leaders were shocked to see that Hamas was capable of this level of resistance, it's important to understand that this is ultimately a psychological and tactical victory for the Palestinian resistance. Similarly to the TET offensive of 1966, when the Vietnamese people launched a surprise attack on U.S. imperialist forces. And this shocked the U.S. public, which has been led to believe by its political and military leaders that the North Vietnamese were simply incapable of launching such an ambitious military operation, much like the world may have believed that Palestinians are incapable of freeing themselves. Up until now, when the resistance has made it clear that they are a force that must be contended with. And this is especially important as a message to the Arab leaders that continue to build normalization agreements with Israel, right? Why are they normalizing them? For their sophisticated technology and surveillance and their weapons to ensure that they have, you know, this level of protection. Well, Israel can't even protect itself from a besieged, starving, constantly bombed population that has prevented access to water and electricity. How is it going to provide any sufficient weapons or technology or surveillance, you know, for these Arab nations? And that Arab nations have a population that can be organized into a powerful resistance that can defend themselves. If the people of Gaza were able to organize themselves in that way, then other Arab nations are capable of doing that as well. And not to play into like conspiracy theories that this all happened, you know, because Saudi Arabia was about to sign a normalization agreement with Israel. But, you know, it is a message to the Arab world that we have the capability as Arabs, as Palestinians, to fight and defend our own land, and that we don't need to rely on imperialist and colonial forces, you know, to get that like surveillance and technology and everything from. And ultimately, it sends a message to the Israeli public that as long as there is no justice, as long as Palestinians face oppression, that there will never be peace, that peace cannot ever be had on stolen land, and that there will always be a price to pay. There's always a cost of maintaining the occupation, and that Palestinians will remain a thorn in the side of the occupation and make sure that, you know, they're not able to just frolic on our land freely after they colonize it and you know, maybe 100 years from now, like give us land acknowledgements, and that, you know, we'll be okay with that.
Charlotte, did you want to add anything?
Sure. I just wanted to clarify, because I think I might have been unclear. Of course, the Palestinian resistance will never achieve victory alone. So just as much as and I would never argue that, just as much as we talk about imperialist and Zionist and Arab reactionary regimes as part of essentially the camp of enemies facing the Palestinian people, this is a Palestinian, Arab, and international struggle for liberation. And so when we're talking about the possibility of victory, it wouldn't be possible to conceive of a victory for Palestinians without the role of the regional resistance forces and without the fact that we're in a world that is increasingly a multipolar world. It's very different than the world of the 1993 promulgation of the Oslo Accords. We're talking about a world in which U.S. imperialism does not have sole hegemony over the future of the world. And so, of course, I would define it as a Palestinian, Arab, and international struggle, but certainly Hamas and Islamic Jihad, leading forces in this movement, would also define it as an Islamic struggle. And just as imperialist powers are sending weapons to the Zionist regime, we have our weapons of organizing, protest, struggle, popular action, mobilization, boycott, mobilizing labor forces, student forces, essentially all of the popular forces that have the national liberation movements, from the movement in the Philippines to the Black Liberation Movement to indigenous struggles for sovereignty and self-determination, all of which forces are coming into direct contradiction with imperialism. So, of course, we can obviously see the very visible role of the Lebanese resistance, the Yemeni resistance of Iran, of forces of resistance in Iraq and Syria. But I agree completely that the role that we're playing outside, the role that we're playing in the core, in the heart of the belly of the beast, in the heart of the imperial core, is a necessary role. And it's not only a kind of a general movement for justice, although it certainly is that, it's also a weapon of popular struggle in the hands of the Palestinian people and in the hands of their collective and broad resistance. And there's no question that the resistance is multi-layered, from cultural, political to armed, and that all of these are critically important and can be the right tactic in a particular space and in a particular time. That the armed struggle to liberate Palestine, just as in the original Palestinian National Charter, is the key strategy for the liberation of Palestine that has been identified by the resistance forces throughout the year. Just to go back to the topic of the Oslo Accords and the destruction of Oslo and what we've all seen over the past 30 years, that one of the major objectives of the whole entire Oslo process was to cut off Palestinians in exile and diaspora. And that was also one of the main purposes of the anti-terror laws, because there were supporters of all of the Palestinian liberation organizations and movements and factions in the United States, in Europe, in Canada, everywhere that there are Palestinians in exile and diaspora that were not disconnected from the resistance organizations and the movements, even if their armed operations at this point were in Palestine. I mean, historically, that certainly wasn't always true. It definitely wasn't true for the PFLP. It wasn't true for other resistance organizations historically. But by the 1990s, that was the case, but it certainly wasn't the case from a political perspective, a social perspective. And the Oslo Accords themselves and the anti-terror laws that went alongside it were meant to sever that connection, to cut people off from their right to return and to cut people off from their movements. And so to extinguish those rights, when Palestinians in exile and diaspora organize, fight back, and work to reclaim their role in all levels of resistance and all spheres of resistance. I mean, one of the things that we've been seeing is not just the role of the Lebanese resistance, for example, since October 7th, but also the role of Palestinian organizations in Lebanon that have been actively involved in armed struggle across the border from Lebanon to Palestine. And that's reclaiming a role that has been denied to the Palestinian people in Lebanon for the past 40 years. And that's a significant thing that has happened since October 7th of this year. Finally, just to say that in many ways, October 7th was a death knell for the process of normalization that was, around the Abraham Accords and the push towards Saudi normalization, even though they're still serving the same reactionary role. But that there are still these kind of classic normalization agreements from Camp David, Egypt, Wadi Araba, to, of course, Oslo itself, and this institution of the PA that still exists. So right now, there's a real demand to open the Rafah crossing for the entry of goods and services, and particularly fuel, from Egypt into Gaza, to make not to, as Egypt would say, to allow the Israelis to push Palestinians into Sinai, even though that's certainly one of their goals, but quite the opposite, to strengthen Palestinian steadfastness to be able to stay on their land. And this is one of the places where I think pressure could be particularly critical at this time, in order to provide mechanisms of support to the Palestinian broad population that are currently being denied that support because the Arab reactionary regimes that are involved in normalization do not have the sovereignty to control their own border with occupied Palestine and specifically with Gaza.
Thank you, Shirley. What, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, folks. That was really amazing, riveting, and really deep and trenchant analysis. Tareq, you were mentioning the historical context in which Hamas emerged. Of course, in 1982, the PLO were kicked out of Beirut. I think about 8,000 of their fighters.
I'm not sure the number,
But quite a few of the fighters, and the immediate result of that was, of course, the Shatila massacre. Yeah. An obscure Russian once said that there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks when a lot of things happen. And I agree wholeheartedly with your conclusion that this is a huge paradigm shift, a massive paradigm shift. Palestinians know it, the Israelis know it, the Arab League knows it, the Europeans and the United States know it as well. So I feel that they are starting to plot behind the scenes to do something, and something that might end up being like what happened in 1982. And Siraj mentioned at the start that as academics, as colonial academics or freedom-loving academics, we need to position ourselves in relation to the hypocrisy that they might come up with to deal with a humanitarian crisis. So have you got any fears that something like Beirut 1982 might happen? And functionally, how can we react to that? Because there are some people in our movement who would probably appreciate something like that, because it would be framed in this humanitarian way as well. I had another question, but I'm exercising discipline, and I'll just drop you an email about it. Thank you very much.
Well, yes, I think the comparison with 82 is actually really powerful, and there's a piece called "Let's Not Hurry to Our June" in the New York Review of Books that was just published. That's very powerful, that makes that comparative lens. So yes, I do think that every effort is in place now in two ways to try to not recreate 82, but in terms of some of the approaches that Israel and the U.S. are adopting to engage with the Palestinian political faction. Really the effort from the invasion of Lebanon in 82 was to try to depoliticize the Palestinian movement, so to try to decimate the PLO. And the language we hear today about Hamas is similar, that, you know, they want to rout out the terrorists, they want to be able to decimate that, to sort of kill the political project of Palestinians. And so, as I said at the beginning in my call, that's a call to genocide, because Hamas is embedded in the Palestinian national movement. And just like trying to root out the PLO resulted in massacres, we see what the effort to try to root out Hamas is looking like. It looks like genocide. The impetus behind this is not Hamas. It's to depoliticize the Palestinian movement. So it's not, so let's say Hamas tomorrow were to disappear completely. The issue isn't going to go away, because Palestinians are still going to organize politically around their demands. So that issue will recreate itself to a future Israeli government. The goal is to pacify Palestinians, to allow them to exist as civilians under Israeli apartheid, but not to organize politically for their demands. So that's what they mean when they say decimate Hamas. Now, the first iteration of that effort after October 7th was ethnic cleansing in the form of humanitarianism. So let's create a safety corridor, Palestinians can leave, and this becomes the way that we empty Palestinians or empty Gaza of Palestinians, and so we get rid of that political problem. When that didn't happen, for all the reasons that we know, now the goal is, okay, within Gaza, there's a form of this nonsensical idea to decimate Hamas, and it's appearing in ways that are actually quite, I mean, apart from the horrible, horrifying civilian death toll, quite funny in the sense of they're unable to do anything. They keep coming out with all these propaganda efforts to try to suggest that they're actually getting back hostages or fighting tunnels, but they're failing on every level. We're in the 36th day of the war, and they haven't been able to gain any major success or any major victory. So this is nothing other than a reaction that's sort of trying to get a horrifying death toll out of Palestinians. Now, the Biden administration, and I believe, is starting to shift and to understand where the Israelis are sort of dragging them into this war that's never going to end, because Hamas will never be decimated. And they're beginning to think about the day after. And what the day after looks like, according to them, is to create a situation where there's another Bantustan. So where there's another Palestinian authority that will be driven into the Gaza Strip on the back of an Israeli tank, and that will create some kind of stabilization effort to, again, pacify the Palestinians under an overarching regime of apartheid. It's going to fail for all the reasons that we know, but also because Palestinian resistance in the West Bank hasn't ended. So the idea that there can be a Palestinian authority that can stabilize the Gaza Strip and pacify resistance under an overarching regime of apartheid will fail. And so we're in this situation where actually you say this is a paradigm shift. I say this is a paradigm shift. Americans understand that this is a paradigm shift, but they're trying to do everything in their power to put us back in the paradigm we just exited. And it's going to fail because that paradigm failed. And so there will be a moment, I think, and this is why the idea of victory, the stakes are so high. And I say this with fear. The Palestinians are facing another Nakba. This could be a generational thing. And the way that we come out of this is really a matter of the highest stakes. So they will try to put us back into that paradigm. It will fail, but at what cost will we be able to stay in this new paradigm, which is the post-partition paradigm? That's what keeps me up at night. When does that genocidal violence end? How does it end? What form does it take? Is a question that's really difficult to answer. So I think that the stakes now are really high, but things are unfolding. when I look at the past 36 days, the Palestinians have shown such immense strength that it's actually sobering that this power, the Israelis haven't been able to defeat them, haven't been able to carry out what they intended. But I don't think we've seen the end of this. Yeah.
What are you guys doing? How long can you stay?
I need to leave in a couple of minutes.
Can you, one more question?
One more question.
Okay. Can we have one more? So,
Oh, sorry.
oh, is there a question here?
There.
Please.
Just briefly about solidarity within CUNY, and if you have suggestions around that, around building solidarity within the City University of New York's institution, and this is coming from someone whose ancestors resisted the Palestinian resistance, is the Taínos resistance, is the Wampanoags resistance, is the Chiricahua Apaches resistance, is the San Carlos Apaches resistance, is the Pueblo revolt, it is the Rama in Nicaragua, it's the Yanomami in Brazil, it's the Wet'suwet'en. We're all standing on Turtle Island in resistance with you, because we are also resisting an ethno-state here, ongoing. So when thinking about solidarity and what we can do as students of this institution.
Well, first of all, I think this is a good time to plug the stickers that we have here. The CUNY is complicit in genocide because this university has been deeply entrenched in not only investing in companies that maintain the occupation of the Palestinian people, but also stifling dissent for that occupation. And we see this in the form of targeting students for justice in Palestine chapters across CUNY. I not only graduated from CUNY Law, I also attended CUNY undergrad since 2012. So I've been, part of or like, I guess adjacent to this institution for the past decade. And we've been seeing the same thing over and over again, whether they use bureaucratic means to silence us, whether it's like false claims of like needing to maintain security. Last night, I was supposed to speak at an event at CUNY Law with Fatima Muhammad and Ahmed, who we all graduated from CUNY Law. Like literally, Ahmed graduated, the next year was me, and then after me was Fatima, and both Fatima and I gave the graduation speech at CUNY. They didn't even let her into the building to pray. They didn't even allow her into the building as an alum to pray last night after an event that had been advertised for weeks. The night before they told us that the event was going to be canceled. And so we mobilized a protest of several hundred people outside of CUNY Law within 3 hours, right after the Columbia University protest that we helped mobilize as well. And we also mobilized with NYU SJP today. So for many of us, it was like 3 protests within a 24-hour time frame, all centered around students and their ability to organize for Palestine, on campus. Getting repressed for saying things like from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, or even having like the chancellor of CUNY in repeated statements, right, express total solidarity with Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people and with Israel, and fail to mention or lend any support. They're not even pretending to be neutral. They're going completely mask off. So the need to organize on campus is stronger than ever. There are groups like CUNY for Palestine who organize this today that people can get involved with, SJP chapters, or even if you are part of another organization, building that organization and helping them understand to exactly build that solidarity, build up those relationships with SJP. For example, at Columbia, one of the chants that we had, yesterday was Columbia, you will see we are all SJP, and that's hearkening to the fact that 50, I think, student organizations banded together to demand divestment, which is what SJP initially wanted to do on Columbia anyway. So their silencing of them just activated this, whole network, similarly to how we did at CUNY Law. 22 student organizations came out in support of me and in support of Fatima, and we were attacked in docks, and they demanded us to be expelled, Zionist organizations, or when they tried to prevent Fatima from speaking at graduation, or when we wanted to pass BDS, right? Standing together always makes us stronger. So even being part of other liberation struggles, other student organizations is such a powerful gift. and an important point for us, right, to build on, because when we are inevitably silenced, when we are inevitably attacked by the university, leaning on that support is really powerful. So that's just some concrete ways, I think, and like depending on the institution you are, even if there isn't an SJP, getting plugged into networks like CUNY for Palestine to lend that support, even if you're in other places, or to bring in, groups from other liberation struggle, which is what we're doing around like the People's Hearing, which calls out CUNY for its racism, not just against like the Palestinian people, but against all oppressed people, are just some things that come to mind.
Want to keep Tareq perhaps here, but I don't think we can, so I think we have to let you go.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Be wonderful.
Yeah, seriously, that was amazing. I'm gonna like
Please,
make
please,
it
please, please.
required like video for people.
Please,
We should be
Seriously.
Just on like a follow-up to what Nerdeen was saying, there's a secret direct action happening at the graduation tomorrow morning. So if anybody is free at 10 a.m. and wants to take part in it, just come talk to me. I'll tell you about it.
And also, super quickly, we have our next teach-in on Saturday at 11 a.m. at Zoom only. We're talking with comrades on the ground in Palestine about conditions and how things are developing and the continuity of the change. So please come along to that.
And thank you so much, Nerdeen and Tareq and Charlotte. We get some food, everybody.
I'm so happy that I was here for the product and talking about me.
Thank you.